Well, I'd like to welcome everybody. This is Steve Benjis. I'm NERI's Executive Director and a partner with Joan Tabachnick in running NERI Press. I'd like to welcome you all. And the topic for today is engaging bystanders in sexual violence prevention that Joan will be presenting. And I'll have a lot more to say about Joan in a moment. But for now, I'd like to introduce you all to NERI Press, particularly to those of you who may not be so familiar with what we do. And our mission is to share the cutting-edge research and best practices emerging in our field. Now, towards that goal, for many years, we only sold books, and that's how many of you may know of us. But with changes both in the publishing world and in technology, we're exploring what it means to maintain our mission while moving forward with a broader definition of our work as an entity for what we call knowledge dissemination. And over the last 5 years, we've expanded our offerings to include online courses, a free monthly research to practice newsletter for adolescents, some face-to-face trainings, and now most recently, these webinars by some of our internationally recognized authors. Now, just like any other workshop, we have learning objectives, which we need to state at the beginning and want to state as well. So today, participants who are joining us will be able to understand the role of engaged bystanders in preventing sexual violence, learn how to use various tools that will help you to teach others about bystander intervention, and identify multiple intervention opportunities to prevent sexual violence. And many of you know from just the local news media of late how critical getting bystanders actively involved with our work is to successful outcomes. So before I turn this over to Joan, let me say a few words about her. Now, I'm really thrilled to do this because I've had the pleasure of working with Joan for many years as my close colleague at NERI Press. And she really is a gifted administrator and a really very substantial and significant thought leader in our field around violence prevention. And in addition to being the director of NERI Press, Joan is nationally recognized for expertise in sexual violence prevention and social marketing. For the past 20 years, she's developed educational materials and innovative programs for national, state, and local organizations. She's the author of Engaging Bystanders in Sexual Violence and Prevention, which was written for the National Sexual Violence Resource Center and SVRC. Her other work includes something called A Reasoned Approach, the Reshaping of Sex Offender Policy to Prevent Child Sexual Abuse and Gatekeepers for Kids. All of these books are well worth your time getting hold of and reading. Joan is a pleasure to read and a pleasure to work with. She's currently a fellow at the Department of Justice, focusing on sexual violence prevention. So we planted her in the federal government, and she's doing a great job there. Joan, it's really a pleasure to have you presenting today, and I'm happy to turn this webinar over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to look on the technology here a little bit and see if I can get this to go to my screen as well. Great. So thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that a lot. And so really, it's always been it's a pleasure working with you, and I always love to see whatever adventure we're going to take next. So this is, for me, this is a little bit different because I am now sort of feel like I move from behind the screen to in front of the screen. So thank you. And I'm particularly excited about doing this webinar today with NERI Press because in the past, when I've done these workshops, they've been mostly for victim advocacy organizations. And I think that we might be having a little bit different conversation today because a lot of you who, at least I see in the list, are people who work with either adult sex offenders or with sexually aggressive youth or children with sexual behavior problems. And I think especially for those who work with their families as well, we will be having a slightly different conversation because a lot of bystander programs are about learning how to have the conversations, and you know how to do that. And it really is sort of a slight shift. And let me give you an example. A few years ago, I had a chance to hear a keynote speaker talk about bystander intervention on college campuses, and that's where a lot of the bystander programs are being developed. And he described sort of a typical situation at a party where a young man and a young woman were having a good time, they're drinking a lot, they're both getting drunk, maybe the young woman might be getting even more drunk, and the young man tries to talk her into going back to his room. And in the scenario that the keynote was talking about, another young man saw what was going on and walked up to them and checked in with the young woman, and she really was drunk, and basically was able to arrange for her to go back with her to her own room with her own friends. And the keynote also talked about how this is great bystander intervention, and probably without the bystander intervention program, the second young man might not have known what to do and how to do it. So I absolutely agree with him. But if you put the lens of those of us who work with offenders or work with the kids with sexual behavior problems, the natural question is then what happens the next day? Who's actually talking to the young man who is drunk when he's sober? And to find out really what was going on for him, and to talk to him about healthy consent and things like that. So that to me is the actual additional piece of the conversation that I'm hoping that we can add today. And to say that this whole concept of bystander intervention is not new, Edmund Burke lived in the 18th century, to the 1700s, and talked about that the one condition necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. That really is a description of bystander apathy. The research, however, is much newer than the 17th century. And the whole term of bystander apathy really came from a particular case, a particularly horrific case, in 1964 in New York City, where Kitty Genovese was walking home late at night after she was closing down a bar where she was working. And she was raped and also murdered outside of her New York City apartment. And the story is that 38 people witnessed the attack, in some way hurt her. The attack lasted for over half an hour, and no one intervened. And I want to come back to this story because I actually know a little bit more about it. But because of this horrific case, and it really did hit the media. I was 9 years old at the time, and I remember my parents talking about this. I remember hearing about it in the news. But the research really sort of came out of this one key event. And the definition of bystander is one who's present but not taking part in a situation or event, a chance spectator. So for the record, I just want to say that I actually do not like the term bystander for this very reason. The definition says you're not taking part, and you're a chance spectator. And I actually believe when you're thinking about sexual violence, you can't be a chance, you can't be a spectator and not be affected by whatever it is that you're watching. So you can't be unaffected by it. And also your watching has an impact. Your choice to not do anything also has an impact on the victim and on the offender. A friend of mine talked to me about the fact that she was mugged, not sexually abused, but she was mugged in a New York City subway 20 years ago. And when she talks about it, she said the piece that lingers for her is not the mugging, but it was the fact that there are people who were in the subway, even across the tracks, so they were safe, and they didn't do anything. They didn't yell. They didn't call the police. And it's that lack of doing anything is what's lingering for her. And if you think about it from the offender point of view, one of the first offenders that I had a chance to talk to who was in prison, and he specifically said, I'm not saying this to blame anybody, but he said that he was doing a lot of behaviors like taking young boys to family picnics and lots of other things that would be warning signs. And he said the fact that nobody in his family, nobody in his circle of friends, and nobody in his work ever asked him anything about it. He said it's not blaming those people, but he said it felt like it was tacit permission for what he was doing. So the not saying anything has a huge impact on both the victim and the offender. So the story, I would say, behind bystanders needs to change. If you think about it, it's really through the voices of survivors and through victims and the courage to speak out. We now have a face. We have many faces. We see the diversity and the complexity of the issue from the view of the survivors and of sexual violence. Through the media, we're beginning to also get an image of the offender. He tends to be a male, and he tends to be a monster or hardly human. They talk about the dirty old man lingering on the edge of the playground. These are the kind of the images that we have are sort of a sadistic pedophile. So they're not human, but we do have an image of an offender. But in most of these cases, we don't have any image of a bystander. They literally don't exist in our storylines yet. So you think about it, it's really through the courage of the voices of victims that we begin to have faces and a voice and an image and an ability to respond. over the years, we've begun to again have a little bit about the victim and the offender interaction, begin to know mostly through victim information, through survivors' information, but who the offenders are. They're the people we know, people we care about often. The people are sort of in our lives. What we don't have is, it's almost like a blank space about the people surrounding the victim or the survivor and people surrounding the offender. So partly what we need to do is begin to have stories. We need to begin to introduce the bystanders into our stories. And so that when we think about this, the victim then is no longer alone. And the offender is actually responsible for their actions to more than just themselves, but to all the people that are surrounding them. So this is the shift that we need to begin to sort of think about. And what it does is it allows us to think about ways that we can intervene. And so in that story I talked about earlier on the college campuses, not just intervening at the moment, but also what needs to happen the next day. Who needs to have that conversation with the young man? Also, who needs to have the conversation before? Because we see these behaviors. We sometimes see behaviors that don't quite match the situation. And again, those who work with offenders, those who work with kids with sexual behavior problems, you probably have a little bit of like a radar that says, something not quite right here. An example, I remember talking to a woman who her husband was sort of like the family photographer and used to take pictures at all the family events. And she noticed that sometimes that there'd be more, as she's had a chance to look at them, there tended to be more pictures of the young girls in the family than anybody else. And she never really asked about it. It wasn't until he was convicted or accused of sexually abusive behavior that some of these other pieces started to fall into place for her. So those are the kinds of red flags or warning signs that we want to think about looking for, and then learning how to just ask questions, how to talk about it. And when you talk about it, it means that you become askable. You become a person in the family who can actually say something. So why is a bystander approach so important? Well, it really does allow us the opportunity to intervene before sexual violence has occurred, before someone makes that choice to perpetrate sexual violence. And it allows us to intervene and prevent sexual violence before that initial perpetration and before initial victimization. And I think that, again, you have insights into how to talk about it. And what I want to do is to talk about that, not just that insight about when to talk about and the intervening when you see something that's sexually abusive or even harassment, but Cordelia Anderson has this wonderful continuum of behaviors where he talks about what's healthy and age-appropriate, mutually respectful, and safe. If you move down that continuum, you move to then mutually flirtatious and playful. And let's say that you're talking about mutually flirtatious behaviors, but then not between two peers, but between a child and an adult. It may be mutual, it may be playful, but it becomes then age inappropriate and then may move into non-mutual, into harassment, and into sexually abusive and violent. If we wait until we see the harassment and sexually abusive and violent behaviors before we actually say something, that's the most difficult conversation to have. It's the most and makes it much more difficult to intervene. Think about moving up that, if we can actually have those conversations when it's age inappropriate, or maybe even to acknowledge and talk about what's healthy and age appropriate. If we have the conversations that healthy, it becomes easier to have the conversation when it's inappropriate and easier when it's abusive. And I love to sort of talk about this in terms of green light behaviors, yellow light behaviors, and red light behaviors. And if we can talk about all of those behaviors, then you become more able to intervene in all aspects. So you can intervene all along that continuum, and again, you become askable. It's also not just one person who can intervene. Do you remember that the sort of stick drawing that I had there on bystanders? There are many people who can intervene at many different places, and you can intervene many times, many points over time. So you can intervene in a variety of different behaviors, a variety of people can intervene, and you can do it in terms of before, during, and after any particular event. So the key question then is, what motivates a bystander to take action? And then I think is something which what we find is that in the key, going back to the Kitty Genovese story, what I think what we're finding now is someone actually went back and did a lot of research around it, and actually there's a great NPR story about if you Google Kitty Genovese story. But basically what he found was that that in the research was that some people actually did do something. Some people called the police, but the police then didn't respond. when a person called the police, and the police, according to the police records, that they asked that the person what was, where it was coming from, and they said the screaming had stopped, and so the police didn't respond at that point. Someone else yelled outside to ask like what was going on, but because Kitty Genovese didn't respond at that point, they didn't do anything. So it really wasn't apathy. What it was that some of the people didn't know what to do, or what they tried wasn't effective. So a key question is what motivates a bystander to take action. Out of that particular event, Latane and Darley developed these sort of 5 decisions a bystander must take in order to take action. And they must actually say yes to all 5 of those. That's a lot for someone to do. What I'd like to do is go through each one of these and talk about what the research is telling us about around bystander and what it takes for a bystander to intervene. So, so the first thing you need to notice the event. And what we find is that awareness of sexual abuse has increased dramatically over the past 20 years. And if you think about that offender that I was talking about earlier, that all the signs were there, and no one in his family or a circle of friends asked him about it, I think that actually people are actually more aware of those things and might actually intervene or might ask at this point in time. So then the next step is then, if you notice something, you need to consider is that situation a situation that demands some action? What are you actually seeing? What information do you need? And I would just challenge us to say that pretty much any situation that you notice, it can be an acknowledgement of saying something or doing something that may not be for you directly, but it may be something that you say, like, I don't necessarily need to be the person, but somebody else can be, and how can I get involved to make sure that happens? So third, you need to decide if you have a responsibility to act. And this is probably where the majority of the research lies. So what we found is that the number and the characteristics of the bystanders has an impact on whether or not you act. So if you're in a larger group of people, you're less likely to act than if you're alone and see a situation. If you're in a large group of people and some people have more responsibility in that situation, you're less likely to act as well. So the number and the characteristics of other bystanders has an impact. Also, the relationship between the bystander and the victim or the abuser. So if you know the victim, or if you know the person who's at risk to abuse, you're more likely to take action than if these are perfect strangers. Or if you maybe identify in some way, have some empathy for the victim, then you're also more likely to take some action. So, for example, someone was talking about how they were groped on a subway, and when they saw someone else being groped, and they remember what that was like when they were 14, they then said something about it because they had a lot of empathy with the victim. And then last is think about what the risks and the benefits of action. This is where it's really important to think, is it safe for the bystander to say something or to do something? And also, what are the benefits of it would have an impact? So if I say something, then will my child, for example, be safer because I've said something in the playground about this child? Then I'm more likely to take some action. So all of these have a huge impact on whether or not somebody takes action. And then if you decide that you do have a responsibility, you need to figure out what form of assistance you should use. So awareness is high, but what we found too was just a random digit dial telephone survey we did, is that awareness is higher around sexual abuse, but people often don't know what to do. And we compared it to drinking and driving. We found that awareness was high around sexual abuse, also awareness was high around drinking and driving. But when we asked if someone is at risk to either drink and drive or at risk to abuse, most people actually knew what to do around drinking and driving, but hardly anybody knew what to do if they saw someone might be at risk. So choosing the form of assistance is something that we need. It's very difficult. It reflects the complexity of our situation. In one of the bystander intervention programs called Bringing in the Bystanders, they offer 51 different options. We need to find ways of taking this complex issue and simplify it. In the same way in drinking and driving, you know that either take away the keys or offer a ride. We need to think about this as well. We also need to understand how to implement the choice. That people may know that they need to do something, but they're not sure they have the knowledge, the skills, or the training, or even the resources or the contacts that are needed to actually implement that choice. So if they need to make a report, do they know how to make that report? Or it may just be so emotional. I know for myself, when I had a situation many years ago, my daughter was young, even though I've trained about this, talked about this, read about this, when it came to my own daughter, I was actually just too emotional. I actually literally could not think through what I should do. Luckily, I had people I could call, I could think it through, and then could figure out how to act. But having access to those resources is really critical to making sure that people actually take action. So going back to my point earlier, that you as people who work with those who might be sexually abusive, those who work with survivors as well, you have the skills. If you see something, you actually have almost that radar, as I mentioned earlier, to see something. And if you see something, how important it is to say something. Steve, I thought you might be particularly, as I know Albert Einstein is one of your heroes. He said that the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. So if you think about that we have the skills, that's something, if we begin to actually take our skills and what we see and start talking about that, start sharing that. So many people that I've talked to over the years have said they wish that they had seen what was going on. And these are things like I wish that, that like we see a cousin at a wedding who makes comments all the time about young girls. Someone sort of talks about, like, what do you say? How do you actually have that conversation? So you can talk about, this is the behavior you're seeing, this is how it makes you feel, and that this is a family wedding, this is the impact, and specifically you would like them to stop that behavior. And if hopefully they're a family member, they'll listen. If they don't, that's when you might want to enlist other people in the family as well. In my own synagogue at one point, there was someone who was beginning to took on a leadership position, but also sharing a little bit too much of his personal stories with some of the young people. So someone just had to have that conversation of why that behavior might be problematic, and saying that this is something that's important for them to stop, and then make sure that they did stop those behaviors. So important to actually begin to have those skills, see what's going on, and then saying it. Those are some of the ways that we address it from an individual perspective. What I think is actually very exciting about the last 5 years is that there's actually a lot that's been actually taking bystander intervention out of sort of just the individual and relationship part of the ecological, social ecological model, and moving it into community and society realm as well. For those people who may not be familiar with the social ecological model, it's basically it's a model around public health uses to say that in order to make change in our society on a systemic level, we need to make change at the individual level, at the relationship level, at the community level, and the society level. So we need to make changes on all 4 of these levels. And what we're seeing that, in fact, that we spend a lot of attention focusing on individual relationship, but we need to shift that focus. Let me explain as an analogy. Think about no smoking campaigns. For years, the majority of the no smoking campaigns were about educating individuals, asking individuals, telling an individual about the problems of smoking, showing them pictures of black lungs, the health impact of it, and saying, please stop. That was sort of the majority of the campaign, and that did work for some people, and it does work. But it wasn't until we actually started exploding the no smoking campaigns across the social ecological model that we really actually began to shift how we are in our society around smoking. So think about that. We began to talk about the impact of secondhand smoke, and asking friends basically to ask their friends and their family members to please stop smoking, and the impact on them. On a community level, we started creating no smoking in public places, where when I was working at the Department of Justice, the last time I was there for my fellowship, I noticed they had a sign that says you can't smoke within 25 feet of the entrance there. So this is what can be done at a community level. And at a society level, we started putting tax and increased the price of cigarettes. Together, all of these different aspects together was what actually we were able to shift where we are from where we are when I was growing up to where we are today, where there's really mostly no smoking in any kind of public places and a huge decrease in smoking. So when it's just an education campaign, it's a critical component, but it's not enough to make that kind of shift around the health of America. And that's sort of what we're doing here around sexual violence at this point. This is a wonderful quote that I love using almost in every presentation from the Institute of Medicine Health Promotion Study, which said it's unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, the cultural, and physical environment conspire against such change. It really speaks to the importance of the environment. So how do we begin to change and think about the change? How do we make this concept real? I love this particular concept here, and And I'm not sure if you'll be able to write in, and I'm not sure I can actually read these. So maybe Steve, you can jump in with what if you can see what people are writing in. But here's just as a scenario. This came from Frameworks, and basically the story is that these cows are dying. And so if you look at this picture, think about why. If you could type in your answers, why do you think the cows are dying? So this is, I live in Western Massachusetts, and so this actually speaks to me. So if you're dialing in from New York City or Chicago or some other places, this particular example may well come up with a different one. But this came from Frameworks. Steve, I'm not sure, are people typing in, or do you see anything there? You're able to jump in? So I guess I'll keep going. So just typically the way people sort of respond to this, which probably is in maybe in how you're responding, hopefully as well. So they could be dying for a lot of different reasons. It could be there's something wrong with the grass or the feed that they're being given. There might be something wrong with there's hereditary, some disease. There might be a mad cow disease that's going through. Some of my favorites, someone saw there's a fence in the background there and said that maybe that this particular farmer is having a fight with a farmer next door and they're sort of poaching, or maybe they're actually poisoning the water. This is looking at it from an individual relationship kind of level. What if we shift this to a larger community thing, and then think about why do you think then that the cows are dying? So if you look at this, if you open up the lens to that broader look, the reason the cows are dying when you look at this picture is because of the pollution. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And so that wider lens and how we frame this becomes essential to sort of really what we can look for. And how we frame this will allow us to then move from the individual relationship of the bystander intervention to what we can do around the systemic issues that also may allow for the bystanders to be more likely to take action. So bystander approach offers responsibilities to both men and women and discourages a certain defensiveness among anyone. So you're allowed to talk about what needs to happen, what everybody needs to do. It creates a broader community context, which I'll talk about more in a minute. It discourages victim blaming, which is so essential, I think, to getting everybody involved. And then it certainly imparts skills, but I think what's more important, it imparts hope that we actually can do something, that this is not something that will just keep happening, but actually we have an opportunity to make a difference to actually end sexual violence in our lifetimes. And I think that our investment is absolutely changing. I think in each of these actually horrific stories that are in the media, there's always maybe an unintended consequence and I think an opportunity. And to me, the Sandusky case is a watershed moment because not only were the victims believed when they went to court and that they were able to successfully prosecute Sandusky, but also the institution was then held responsible for not responding when they had information. And it's the first time that actually I think that there was this widespread public support for holding the institution responsible. Certainly that's happened in the past. You think about the Catholic Church. But there was a lot of a very different kind of public support and also mixed support for that. So it really became a wake-up call, I think, for insurance companies, for institutions working with children and youth. And it's not surprising that the link is also happening onto college campuses as well. Marcus Aruga, who's a colleague of mine in the UK, who did had a lot of conversations with offenders who actually had abused within youth serving organizations. And I always like to tell his story, the stories he shared with me, because they seem to really illustrate how important it is for the institutions to also support the bystander intervention. So he talked about how when he interviewed offenders, he found a certain pattern. For some offenders that they would sexually abuse within one organization, they'd go to another organization and not abuse, and then go to a third organization and abuse again. So he started asking, what was different about that second organization? Why didn't you harm anyone there? And they said basically it wasn't safe for them to harm. That every time they started to break the rules a little bit, when they started to want to, whatever, to have meet with a child behind a closed door, or take a child home when they're not supposed to be taking them home on their own, that the supervisor has trained and would intervene and say, that's not what our policy is, and please don't do that again. And they found that they were being watched too much. There were too many rules and too many policies in place that were protecting the children, which meant that it wasn't safe for them to abuse. So asking what is it possible to do about our environment to make it unsafe for people to cause harm. And there's a number of, I think, really promising practices and promising programs that, Greg, if you could actually post those on the list so people can have access to them. And this will be actually on the Neary Press website as well. But there's a whole series of programs that really speak to what's possible within youth serving organizations. The CDC has a wonderful, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has a wonderful document that's free online called Child Sexual Abuse Within Youth Serving Organization, How to Prevent That. The Enough Abuse campaign put together, and I actually helped to write it, so just full disclosure, a brochure and some fact sheets as well as an assessment tool that you can use within your youth serving organization. I know that Dr. Keith Kaufman from Portland State University is working with Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and we'll be releasing some information about the process there. Safe to Compete, through the National Center for Missing Exploited Children. It was a wonderful conference and also resources for sports organizations working with youth. And then Commit to Kids is a great program that was developed in Canada. Again, all of those resources are available on the, our links are available through the Neary Press website. And also I think that, that I said earlier, that that these are all connected, and there's actually a growing body of information, of evidence-based information around programs that are for college campuses, and having a spokesperson like President Obama has made a huge difference in the attention that college campuses are getting in the media and in terms of the support they're getting for programs today. The current Pope is taking a very different approach than I think what has done in the past in terms of really bringing some of the harm of sexual abuse into the light. The Green Dot program and bringing in Bystanders are two evidence-based programs that have been introduced in college campuses, but are now being brought into high schools as well. And then Safe Dates and Shifting Boundaries are two programs that are being delivered in the middle school, which is such a important developmental stage for us to begin to have these conversations. And both, again, are Safe Dates and Shifting Boundaries are evidence-based processes. Safe Dates is a curriculum, and Shifting Boundaries I actually really love, and I just want to take a moment to talk about that, because what they did was that they tried three different approaches. One where they had just a curriculum and education. They also tried just policy change, and they tried both of them. And what they did for the policy change, they did a thing called hot zone mapping, where they gave the kids a map of the middle school and gave them a red marker and a green marker and asked them to map out where they felt safe and where they didn't. And then the places they didn't feel safe, this would be, again, you would expect like in the stairwells or in the bathrooms, they posted extra supervision in those, either by teachers or seniors. And what they found was that when they had just the curriculum, there was almost no change in the harassment. However, when they had, and then they had both, they had significant change in the harassment. They had both the curriculum and the hot zone mapping. But when they did just the hot zone mapping, they had a significant change in the level of sexual harassment. So combining these different comprehensive approaches really has some promising approaches for prevention. And then last, the Unitarian Universal Association was one of the first faith-based organizations to come up with a policy about what to do if an offender wants to join or how to respond to when sexual abuse occurs within their congregation. So just to end, I want to just say that it's time to really begin to shift the balance. So how do we can help to create an environment where the cost of apathy, of doing nothing, is very high, and the benefits of engagement is so much higher? So thank you very much. This is my contact information. If you want to reach me, you can always reach me through Neary Press as well. And I'm going to turn this back over to you, Steve. Are you there, Steve?
I am here, Joan. I think everybody who's listening to you can really appreciate why you're a thought leader in the field. And, it's interesting to me how far we've come, because when you started this journey many, many years ago, I thought you were kind of on the peripheries of a nutcake who was doing whatever you were doing out there. But it wasn't particularly relevant because we were doing the frontline work, working with offenders, So I think the world has come to you, and I think we really are on the cusp now of possibly really making a very, very significant dent in sexual violence in this country. And it will take a lot more work, and we're not there yet. But The fact that there are over close to 300 people on this webinar says something about people's beginning to understand that bystanders are so critical to our mission to stop sexual violence. So thank you for all that you do. Now, you'll see the slide for those of you who are getting more interested in what Joan has to say. We encourage you to pick up an Engaging Bystander book, and this will tell you how you can go about and order it. There also, for Neary Press, there's our free e-newsletter, Research to Practice. I'll get back to that a little bit later. I jumped a slide ahead. Now, for those of you who are still listening, which is most of you, pardon me? Oh, I get to join. I didn't put my makeup on, though, Glenn, so I don't know about this. There I am. Hi, everybody. Hi, Joan.
Hi, Steve.
You see the question, you've participated through the webinar, but if you have questions for Joan, we have a good 20 minutes that she can be interacting with you all. So I can see your questions, and if you would post them, I'd be happy to send them on to her. But let me get you started, Joan, with one that came here, which is when we're talking about sexual violence as opposed to other kinds of violence, what's the difference when you look at preventing the perpetration of sexual abuse?
First of all, it's a great question. I think that what we're beginning to see more and more is that there is absolutely an overlap between different forms of violence. And in particular, there's a lot of research happening right now between bullying and sexual violence. And so they're beginning to see that the same risk factors for bullying and the same risk factors for sexual violence. So I would say actually that right now we're actually the place more where there's a much more similarities of looking at what are the risk factors and what are the protective factors that would encourage somebody to either to be at, or not encourage someone, but would actually place somebody at risk to abuse. And we're still what we're looking at right now is, and I think that there's a lot of information, and certainly if people are interested in that, there's Ray Knight has written a lot about some of that confluence of the two of those. So you can just Google Ray Knight and bullying, and you probably come up with a lot of his articles. But I think that what we're beginning to see is that whereas a lot of what they call risk factors that are correlated, so we know that that when somebody has sexually abused or someone is violent, they see these different risk factors. But what we don't know as much is what's causative. So that the same people might have the same constellation of risk factors, and one might abuse and one might not abuse. And so we're trying to learn more about what are the risk factors that actually lead to either violent or sexually violent behaviors. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I enjoyed answering it.
It's the nice thing about being on a webinar, Joan, you can never know the answer to that, whether you answered it or not. I have another one here for you, is how effective are the programs that you're recommending? Is there research of outcomes, but whether it's research or just your personal opinion about these various programs that you mentioned? And also, are there any videos that can be used for bystander prevention?
Yeah. So in terms of the programs, yes, I think what's actually very exciting to me is that for the first time we're actually looking at what are the effectiveness, what works and what doesn't work, and certainly we have a lot more to learn. But again, I'm happy to, if you contact me afterwards, I'm happy to send you some articles, or maybe can post some things to the group. But that the CDC has recently, just like 2014, released a study about a review of all kinds of programs that are designed to reduce the perpetration of sexual violence. And what they found is that there are really 3 evidence-based programs. And I mentioned 2 of them here, the Safe Dates and the Shifting Boundaries, aimed at middle school. So those are research-based, evidence-based programs. They also named a number of promising programs, and those are included a lot of the bystander, like the Bringing in the Bystanders, the Green Dot, Dating Matters. There's a number of them that they've mentioned are promising, and what they're looking at, which I love, is that they're not just looking at what programs are helpful in shifting attitudes, because we don't know if shifting attitudes will actually shift behaviors. But they're actually looking at what are they showing in terms of actually shifting behaviors and intent for behavior as well. So of the ones that I've listed in terms of the ones that the four that are evidence-based or promising would be the safe dates, the shifting boundaries, the green dot, and the bringing the bystanders programs are the ones I would look at it as evidence-based. The other ones are also been promising as well. They don't have quite the same level of research and evaluation to them.
So here's another, thanks, Joan. Here's another question. Can you talk a little bit more about the specific characteristics or skills that make for effective bystander intervention?
Well, that's a great question. I think that again, if you dig into some of these, a lot of it has to do with, like, first of all, what age you're talking about. But I would say that that in some level, I would start with the concept that all of us should be engaged bystanders, and so all of us sort of need the skills. Then what skills we need would be first going back through the Latane and Darley and say, like, we first need to be able to notice the event. Be able to know what are we looking for. So part of the skill building would be about understanding what red flags, and not just red flags obviously for victimization, but also red flags and warning signs that someone might be at risk to abuse. So first, understand the red flags and noticing the event. Then there's a skill building and being able to have these conversations. There's a lot of information out there about how you might want to begin the conversation. And having those difficult conversations is something that really needs a lot of practice. So that, again, is a skill. How do you talk about what's healthy? How do you talk about what's of concern? And then also the last piece I would say, making sure that everybody knows the resources, the local resources. So in a situation where I had something going on, that I knew who to call. I knew a place I could call. I knew someone I could call. I actually know, like, if I do need to make a report, I know the phone number I need to call. And if I'm not sure, I actually know the number I can call and say, I have this concern for the situation. Can you give me some advice on this? So knowing what the resources are, all of those would be key kinds of skills that you would need to have. And most of those are the skills which are then taught through a lot of these bystander intervention programs.
Great. This is a very interesting question, and I'm not sure how best to approach it, but what role does bystander intervention play in the choice of victims to take and to continue to pursue criminal or civil and order of protection action against offenders? So what impact do you think bystanders play in victims finding their voice and moving forward to prosecute or civilly prosecute, take civil action against offenders?
So I mean, it's again a great question. I don't have any research on it, but I certainly know from talking to friends and colleagues that, and I think just my own experience over 20 some odd years, if you're the first person to have to say this happened to me, that's a much harder thing to begin the conversation than to say, if someone, like, if you think of what's happening with Bill Cosby, that people coming forward, that people had the courage to come forward 20 years ago, but that our environment has changed enough that people are feeling comfortable now coming forward. And then also when somebody comes forward, then it's easier to say, like, if this person is coming forward, then maybe I can too. So for victims and survivors having a voice, it makes a huge difference. And I think that also, as I think about, again, the conversations I've had with offenders, I remember one man sharing that when his daughter finally disclosed that he was sexually abusing her, that one of the things he said is that he was very ashamed of what he had done, but he was equally ashamed that his daughter had more courage to say something out loud than he did. And then I keep thinking about, what if someone in the family had taken the time to ask something going on, to begin that conversation, to be the first one to say that conversation. There's no research on it, but I can't imagine, given all of these sort of anecdotal stories, that bystanders saying something wouldn't have a huge impact on the environment and on the people that are surrounding them. And certainly taking it a step further, if you're within an organization that makes it very clear that this is that they care deeply about the safety of the children or safety of men and women that are in their care, that and they actually follow through on that. That I can't imagine that also doesn't have a huge impact in terms of shifting the environment that we all are living in and making it a safer place. But I haven't seen the research, and that's a great question.
Great, thanks, Joan. Actually, somebody's sharing a resource for everybody, so I'd want to.
Great.
Have you heard of the culture of respect? Is that something you're familiar with?
Actually, yes, that's a great. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just they're suggesting that folks who are interested take a look at the Culture of Respect website, which is just Culture of Respect. I don't know whether it's .org or .com. It's not saying here, so www. Culture of Respect. Oh, great. And that it's created a matrix of sexual assault prevention education programs with a particular emphasis on bystander intervention, and all the programs on the site are evidence-based, and there's a number of peer-reviewed studies, so I think it may be a great resource, and thank you to Allison for sharing that with us. Another question for you. Says that we're clinicians and tend to look at individual behaviors, but what are some of the environmental issues we should be considering?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think clinicians are beginning, especially when you talk about children and youth. I think most clinicians realize that you can't just treat the individual child. You have to think about the environment that child is living in. So certainly their family, their guardians. So that's already sort of taking it out of the individual and putting it into the family system. But then also, if you're talking about a child or a youth, they also need to go back into the schools. They need to go back, hopefully that, they need to have pro-social activities, so they're involved in maybe sports or other kinds of activities. So getting involved, and hopefully even getting involved before you have a client who's going to actually approach that little league or approach the church. But beginning to have a conversation with them, beginning to have the safety, and so people actually are aware about how to respond, and that people begin to see that. I think that what happens is that people hear, it's almost like I feel like there's an opportunity that people either minimize completely, say, oh, they were just kissing. Why are you sort of overreacting to it? Or they'll sort of say oh my God, this child was running around trying to push himself on everybody, and he's only 5 years old, but he's trying to do it. I don't want them anywhere near my child. So the only way that we can sort of get people to sort of, instead of being at one extreme or the other, we need to get people needs to be a way having an environment which holds people's fears, and then gives them some concrete ways of saying okay, here's a child who does push themselves on everyone, and yes, they're only 5 years old, but if I was my daughter was 5, I wouldn't want her to be exposed to that. So what do we do? How do we make sure that child is being in a safe environment, that they're being observed, and that they're learning what's right, what to do and what not to do. So I think as individual clinicians, as you begin to move out of the individual treatment or the group, and you move into the environment, their family environment, into their community environment, into the pro-social activities, those are all opportunities that really have to do about shifting the environment. And then, Steve, just given the work we do in Massachusetts with MASOC, I also would say that which is a coalition of clinicians looking also at what kind of policy that needs to happen, what kind of policy needs to be changed. I think that it would be wonderful if more people got involved at that level as well. We do need to begin to think about kids differently than adults. And this, to me, is a perfect opportunity for those people, clinicians who work individually to expand their view. I would say just as you have, and maybe, I don't know if you have something to add to that, Steve, because you've actually made that leap in my mind from working as an individual clinician to really looking at more of the societal and the policy level as well.
Well, I don't really want to take up much space, Joan. I mean, I just think that I'm really a product of the 60s, so I've had to channel my outrage and anger somewhere so it doesn't eat me up, and that's always been into some kind of political activism. So for me, when I look out and see the kind of resistance there's been, and I've been in the field for 30 years, so I came in when, the attitude's very, very different than what they are now. We are much more amenable to hearing the message that we have to say. So I just had to do it. So, but it is gratifying when you stay at it for a while to begin to see the kinds of social changes that are taking place, in part from MASOC's intervention with legislators and the press and the narratives that are beginning to take hold. But, also just, as I say, history's coming towards you. So that's an exciting moment. I've got a statement here that I'd like to share with you. Maybe you can comment. And it says, Joan, we've been doing some preventive outreach with at-risk urban youth to educate on consent and healthy sexual behaviors. And in our experience, we encounter a belief system among adolescent males and females that appears to be part of a larger quote-unquote rape culture and degrading to women and girls. It's problematic because these attitudes support victim blaming and reduces the chances of bystander intervention. And is this an area that's been a focus of policy and programming on a larger level? Is there any research addressing this area? Just can you say more about the impact bystander intervention has on victim blaming?
Yeah, again, it's a great question, and I think it's very complex. I mean, the questions are really complex. I feel like I wish we could be in the same room and talk about this for the next 3 hours. So it feels a little bit, for just to sort of give you a quick, 5-minute response, a 2-minute response feels inadequate to such a huge question. So maybe just start a couple thoughts at least in terms of responding. The first is that so one of the things I'm loving about my fellowship with the Department of Justice is that I have a chance to be a total nerd and read lots and lots of research. And one thing I find really striking is that the research that I see happening here in the United States very rarely talks about sexual violence from a gender perspective. But in fact, when I look at research that's happening done internationally, that it's almost always defined as a gender-based violence. And so I think that there's something that we need to learn from those folks who are outside the U.S. in terms of how they can look at it as a gender-based issue, and then what that means in terms of changing the way that we think and do our work here in the U.S. So that's sort of one thing that I really just like to look at, take the time to maybe look a little bit outside what's happening, and then Rachel Jewkes, Jewkes, is probably the person who's written the most about that. And at least I was particularly excited to see some of her research, so I would Google her. In terms of just I think that I think the whole issue of gender has a very different meaning, and I feel like I'm almost too old to talk about gender in some ways because I come at from, if Steve's claim in the 60s, I'm claiming sort of the 70s and the feminist movement, and which I think is a very important grounding. But I also know that the way young kids are thinking about and talking about gender is also very different. But I think some of the same pieces about that that the gender expectations that we have are deeply rooted, and we need to begin to address them. Again, I apologize for the nerd in me, but there's a really wonderful research which was done by a woman, a researcher in Indiana named Armstrong, and I can't remember the other researchers on the project, but that they looked at sexual violence within a Midwestern university. And what they found was that they had very high sexual violence. And what they talked about was that was one of the first places I saw it being talked about as a gender issues. And they said that there was a non-gendered expectation coming into school that everybody's going to have a good time, everybody's going to party, probably drink, maybe have sex. But that when they got to school, there's a very big gender divide. That it was mostly the fraternities, which was male-dominated, controlled flow of the parties, of the alcohol, and that the women also sort of felt at that point with that gender divide that they felt they need to be acquiescent. So what they found was interesting. They compared it to a southern university, and where the fraternities didn't have houses, and that the parties were held in a different, we're in a more neutral space, and the level of sexual violence was much lower there. So I think we need to think about also the structural ways that we encourage that kind of that kind of gender divide almost, and look at it as a gender issue. So I feel like I'm just sharing a lot of, again, this is such a complex conversation, but I think if we don't look at some of those gender issues, I think we're actually going to miss out on some really important parts of the solution.
Great, Joan, thanks.
Yeah.
We really should stop, but I want to ask this last question, so maybe you can sort of address it very quickly. And it's in two parts. I'm only going to ask you the first. Is there any research available on culturally specific modifications for bystander engagement programs?
There's not a lot. And this might be something that maybe if other people who are listening have access to more. I have seen only a few studies, and but I think it's where I have seen some research that's showing actually the need for it, if nothing else. Not necessarily what works, but there's little pockets that are around. There's actually some great work that happening in the South Asian community around restorative justice. It's happening in Southern California. So there's little pockets like that. What I think the research is really showing is that how there are different places where there are higher levels of sexual violence than others, and we need to be thinking about how do we address the unique factors that make those places with this higher sexual violence, how do we make those safer, and the places with those lower sexual violence, how do we learn from those environments as well? And some of those are culturally specific as well. I wish with this short amount of time I can't say, but that there's a lot of interest in this area, I think a growing interest, and I definitely would keep that question on your radar.
Great, Joan, thank you. And there are a lot more questions, and thanks to all of our webinar participants for posting them. I wish that we could spend more time. They're great questions. We really appreciate the interactivity. So I want to just close out this webinar with a couple of announcements, saying also that we do produce a monthly, David Prescott, Joan, and I produce a monthly newsletter called Research to Practice, where we try to pick some of the most poignant research in the field and share it with you in a very short, brief format. So if you'd like to sign up for that, you can do that on the nearypress.org website. You're automatically signed up for it if you join this webinar, and you can always opt out if you find us to be boring and not much interest. But we certainly, the three of us, have been doing this for several years now, and it's a really productive way for us to work together and push each other. You'd also, if you like this webinar, and many of you stayed with us for the entire time, so I assume that you did, you can see previous webinars on our website at www.nearypress.org. I want to just tell you a quick announcement about our next webinar, The Impact of Pornography on Children, Youth, and Culture, with Cordelia Anderson, somebody that Joan mentioned in her presentation. And I really encourage you to attend. Briefly, the basic information provided in the webinar will be helpful to anyone concerned about today's pornography becoming the main sex educator of our children and youth. And all of us who work with these kids know how dramatically, the ease with which you can get free pornography now is impacting on attitudes and perspectives on sex and sexual violence with many of the kids that we work with. And the workshop will discuss the differences in definitions and the research that shows how pornography impacts, and it'll also highlight the importance of framing this as a public health issue and actions that can be taken to counter any harm from pornography and the porn industry. That's on January the 20th. So that's the next webinar. I want to just thank our sponsors very quickly: the Center for Clinical and Forensic Services, the ITM Group, James Reynolds, the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Maple Tree Group Homes, New Hope Treatment Centers, Ranchero Society, Stevens Treatment Programs, Wayne County Juvenile Probation Department in Pennsylvania, Yurick Counseling, and Houston Transitions to Wellness and Counseling. And believe me, we would love to have 2 more slides that we could share with you. So if you're out there and you want to help us out as a sponsor, we would love to have you. And you can reach us on our website or call 540-0712, extension 14. That's area code 413. We would love to send you as a sponsor or as a agency sponsor or an individual sponsor, a copy of current perspectives and current applications. We'll also do the work to register you for every webinar, so you don't have to do it. And for individuals, it's $98, and for organizations, it's $250, and we'll list you here. And, you know, we have to be like NPR where you want to turn the radio off when we're doing the fundraising, but we have to do it to keep ourselves going. Just some reminders. The PowerPoint slides are going to be posted on the website. The recording will be posted next week. And you'll receive an announcement when it is posted and a link to a certificate of attendance. Once again, CE credits are available. Go to the webinar page to find the link, and don't forget to close out your account at the end. Joan, thank you so very much for a wonderful presentation. You're a gift to the field in so many ways, and I'm glad that we could share you with all of the webinar participants.
Thank you so much. And can I just I forgot to mention, this book is available from the NSVRC for free. So if folks do want this, they can just go, there's a link on our website, or you can go to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and you can get this for free. So it's a great booklet, it's free, and has some great exercises to go forward with. So I just want to mention that as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you on January 20th. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.